Russia, early 20th century. A vast empire stretching from Europe to Asia, yet rotting from within. The Romanov dynasty, once seen as ordained rulers of God's will, sat on a crumbling throne. The people were starving. Industry lagged behind the West, and the weight of centuries-old feudal structures suffocated progress. But it was war, World War I, that would deliver the final blow. By 1917, Russia's disastrous performance on the battlefield was undeniable. Millions of soldiers lay dead. Supplies were scarce. Desertion soared. The once mighty army was disintegrating before the eyes of its commanders. And at the center of it all, a Tsar who seemed incapable of steering his nation out of chaos. Nicholas II was detached, insulated in palaces, while the streets of Petrograd boiled with rage. What happens when faith in leadership collapses? When hunger gnaws at the masses and soldiers refuse to fight? History gives us the answer. Revolution. In February 1917, women marched through Petrograd demanding bread. Workers joined them. Then soldiers, once the defenders of order, refused to fire on the crowds. They turned their guns against the regime they once served. Within days, the Romanov dynasty, 3 centuries of imperial rule, was gone. Nicholas II abdicated, leaving a nation unmoored, staggering into an uncertain future. But the fall of the Tsar was not the end. It was only the beginning. A provisional government emerged, promising freedom, democracy, and an end to autocracy. But there was one problem: the war. The new leaders, desperate to maintain their place among the Allies, chose to continue fighting Germany. To the weary soldiers and starving peasants, this decision felt like betrayal. They hadn't risked everything just to keep dying in muddy trenches. And into this fragile vacuum stepped another force, a faction radical, disciplined, and utterly convinced of its mission: the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin had been in exile, but now, sensing opportunity, he returned. His message was simple, powerful, irresistible: peace, land, and bread. Withdraw from the war. Give land to the peasants, food to the hungry, power to the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers. While the provisional government floundered, the Bolsheviks sharpened their rhetoric. The Constitutional Assembly, once hoped to be the voice of the people, was dissolved by Lenin when it failed to give the Bolsheviks full control. This was not compromise. This was revolution with no room for rivals. By October 1917, Petrograd was in Bolshevik hands. Lenin and his comrades had seized the Winter Palace. The provisional government, barely months old, collapsed overnight. The Bolsheviks declared themselves the vanguard of a new order, a government of workers and peasants built on Marxist ideals. But ideals come at a cost. Almost immediately, Lenin's new regime signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending Russia's role in World War I. The price? Huge swaths of Russian territory ceded to Germany. Land, resources, and pride, all gone. For many Russians, this was too much to bear. Allies turned to enemies. Former comrades split apart. The stage was set for one of the bloodiest struggles of the 20th century, the Russian Civil War. Reds versus whites, revolution versus counter-revolution, a nation tearing itself apart. But here lies the question: was the Bolshevik takeover truly the dawn of liberation, or the beginning of a new kind of tyranny? Civil war rarely begins with a single shot. It grows out of fractures, betrayals, and decisions that leave no middle ground. Russia in 1918 was exactly that, a nation splintered, every faction convinced it carried the true future in its hands. The Bolsheviks had secured power in Petrograd, but power in one city does not mean power across a continent-sized empire. Old enemies regrouped, disillusioned allies broke away, and foreign armies saw opportunity in chaos. The revolution that promised peace was about to descend into war, more brutal than the one it had tried to escape. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was the spark. For many Russians, surrendering vast territories to Germany was unforgivable. The left socialist revolutionaries, once allies of the Bolsheviks, stormed out in protest. Liberals and monarchists saw weakness. Nationalists accused Lenin of betraying the motherland. From these ruptures, two camps emerged: the Reds, defending the revolution, and the Whites, a fractured alliance of monarchists, conservatives, liberals, and disaffected socialists. But this was not just a Russian struggle. The Western allies, desperate to stop Germany, sought to open another front. British troops landed in Murmansk. Japanese soldiers marched into Vladivostok. The revolution that had begun in Petrograd was now tangled in the great game of world powers. Then came the most unexpected force of all, the Czechoslovak Legion. Tens of thousands of Czech and Slovak soldiers, former prisoners of war who dreamed of an independent homeland, had been promised safe passage east across Russia. But in May 1918, tensions exploded. Ordered by Trotsky to surrender their weapons, the Legion refused. Instead, they seized the Trans-Siberian Railroad, cutting a steel scar across the heart of Russia. In the vacuum they created, new anti-Bolshevik governments rose, one in Omsk, another in Samara. The revolution was unraveling. For the Bolsheviks, compromise was no longer an option. Lenin turned to force. The Cheka, a secret police force, was given terrifying authority. Arrest, trial, execution, often without warning. Suspected counter-revolutionaries vanished overnight. Political opponents were silenced. Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries driven from councils. It was the beginning of what became known as the Red Terror. And in the summer of 1918, the revolution struck at the very heart of the old order. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, and their children, moved from place to place since the abdication, were now seen as a rallying symbol for the Whites. In July, in the cellar of a house in Yekaterinburg, the entire family was executed. There would be no restoration, no royal figurehead to unite the counter-revolution. The empire of the Romanovs ended, not with abdication, but with a gunshot in the dark. Meanwhile, the battlefield stretched across a shattered land. In the east, Admiral Kolchat gathered forces, bolstered by Allied support. In the south, General Denikin built the volunteer army, hardened by survival in the Kuban steppes. From the north, foreign troops landed in Arkhangelsk and Murmansk, clashing with Red soldiers. From the west, nationalist armies in Ukraine seized their chance, while anarchist warlords like Nestor Makhno carved out their own domains. Russia was no longer a nation. It was a chessboard of armies, a patchwork of shifting alliances and betrayals. And as battles erupted, civilians paid the heaviest price. Crops were seized, villages burned, hostages executed. Famine and disease spread faster than armies could march. Yet the Bolsheviks, cornered and surrounded, did not collapse. Trotsky, as Commissar for War, reorganized the Red Army into a disciplined machine. Harsh punishments kept soldiers in line, but the promise of a worker's future gave many reason to fight. By late 1918, against all odds, the Reds began to claw back control. But even as they regained ground, one question haunted every village, every soldier, every family. Was this struggle really about freedom, or was it simply about which tyranny would triumph? By the dawn of 1919, Russia was already unrecognizable.
Borders had collapsed, foreign soldiers patrolled its ports, and rival governments claimed legitimacy across the vast landscape. But the real test of the revolution was only just beginning. The coming year would decide whether the Bolshevik experiment survived or was crushed beneath the weight of its enemies.
Admiral Kolchak in Siberia struck first. His armies, supplied and advised by Britain and the United States, surged westward. In the spring, they pushed through the Urals, capturing town after town. For a moment, it seemed inevitable. The white tide was rolling toward Moscow itself. Kolchak proclaimed himself supreme ruler of Russia, determined to erase Bolshevism from history. At the same time, in the south, General Denikin's volunteer army grew in strength. Reinforced by Cossacks, nationalists, and Allied shipments through the Black Sea, his forces swept across Ukraine. By summer, cities long under Red control fell into white hands. Odessa, Kherson, and entire stretches of the fertile steppe changed flags overnight. For the peasants, it was yet another wave of masters demanding food and loyalty. Even in the West, new threats emerged. Simon Petlura's Ukrainian nationalists pressed their claim for independence, while anarchist leader Nestor Makhno commanded guerrilla bands that struck without warning. Makhno's fighters, mounted and elusive, turned swaths of southern Ukraine into a zone of chaos. Sometimes allied with the Reds, sometimes their bitter foes, they embodied the fractured, shifting loyalties of the Civil War. And from the north came an even more dangerous thrust. General Yudenich, advancing from Estonia, launched his offensive toward Petrograd. By autumn, his forces stood at the gates of the old imperial capital, threatening to choke the Bolsheviks at their birthplace. For Lenin and his comrades, it was nothing less than an existential crisis. But if the Whites had numbers, the Reds had something else: organization and geography. Trotsky, tireless and ruthless, transformed the Red Army. He crisscrossed the front in his armored train, rallying troops and forcing discipline with an iron hand. Soldiers who faltered were punished brutally, sometimes executed. Yet to others, he was a symbol of determination, a leader who would not let the revolution die. The Bolsheviks also held the center: Moscow, Petrograd, and the dense rail networks of European Russia. They could move men and supplies faster than their enemies, who were scattered on the periphery, isolated and divided. For every advance by Kolchak or Denikin, the Reds could regroup and strike back. And so they did. In April 1919, the Red counteroffensive shattered Kolchak's momentum. Ufa fell, then city after city along the Siberian front. The White armies, stretched thin and harassed by partisans, began a retreat that turned into a rout. By winter, Kolchak himself was fleeing eastward, abandoned by allies, betrayed by local leaders, and hunted across the frozen landscape. His dream of restoring Russia collapsed into snow and exile. In the south, Denikin's advance at first seemed unstoppable. His troops surged northward, reaching Oryol, barely 250 miles from Moscow. Panic spread in Bolshevik ranks. Would the revolution fall less than 2 years after seizing power? Yet Denikin, too, had overextended. His supply lines stretched hundreds of miles, vulnerable to strikes. By late 1919, the Red Army regrouped, drove them back, and turned his Great March into a desperate retreat. By the spring of 1920, Denikin's forces were shattered, their survivors evacuating by sea. Meanwhile, Yudenich's assault on Petrograd crumbled under Red counterattacks. His army, small and undersupplied, was forced back into Estonia, never to threaten the revolution again. But victory did not bring relief. With every White army crushed, famine deepened. Villages lay in ruins, and disease spread unchecked. Typhus swept through cities. Trains, once the arteries of the empire, were broken wrecks. The people who had once shouted for peace, land, and bread now wondered if any promise could survive in the ruins of war. And still, new enemies rose. In the West, Poland, newly reborn, looked eastward with ambition. Its leader, Józef Pilsudski, dreamed of building a great federation from the ruins of empires. In alliance with Petlura, Polish forces surged into Ukraine, capturing vast territories. Moscow itself trembled once again.
The Bolsheviks had survived the Whites, but could they withstand a war with Poland, a nation equally determined to shape the future of Eastern Europe? Would Lenin's revolution spread beyond Russia's borders, or collapse under the weight of foreign bayonets? By 1920, Russia was exhausted. Villages lay in ashes, railroads lay twisted and silent, and millions of civilians were caught between famine, disease, and the bayonets of armies they barely understood. Yet the war was far from over. A new front had opened, one that would determine whether Bolshevik power stayed confined to Russia or ignited across all of Europe. To the west, Poland had risen from the grave. After more than a century of partition, its leaders dreamed of a reborn empire stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. At its head was Józef Pilsudski, a man who believed Poland could be the shield of Europe against both German militarism and Bolshevik revolution. For him, Ukraine was the key. And in Szymon Petlura, the Ukrainian nationalist leader driven from his homeland, Pilsudski found an ally. In April 1920, Polish and Ukrainian forces surged eastward. Kiev fell. The Red Army, already stretched thin, reeled in retreat. To many in Europe, it seemed the Bolshevik regime was finally on the brink of collapse. But the Bolsheviks did not see defeat. They saw opportunity. Propaganda thundered with a new vision. The revolution would not only survive, it would spread. The call went out for a march westward, not only to defend Soviet Russia, but to carry the banner of communism into Poland, Germany, perhaps even the heart of Europe itself. The Red Army rallied, counterattacked, and drove the Poles back from Kiev. By summer, the Bolshevik tide was rising once more. Cities fell, villages were burned, and entire armies fled before them. For a moment, Warsaw itself seemed within reach. Lenin dared to dream of revolution on a continental scale. If the Red Army could break through, who could stop them? But history is rarely kind to such ambitions. In August 1920, outside the Polish capital, the miracle occurred. In what became known as the Battle of Warsaw, Pilsudski executed a daring counterstroke, catching the Reds off guard and driving them into chaos. Thousands of Bolshevik soldiers were captured. Others fled east in disarray. What had looked like an unstoppable march to Europe ended in humiliation. The revolution would not spread by bayonet, at least not yet. Even as defeat in Poland stunned Moscow, another front threatened in the south. In Crimea, General Pyotr Wrangel commanded the last major White Army. Unlike Kolchak or Denikin, Wrangel was careful, pragmatic, and determined to preserve his forces. His army struck northward, retaking parts of Ukraine and Kuban, threatening once again to unravel Bolshevik control. But the Reds were relentless. By late 1920, the reorganized Red Army pressed Wrangel back toward the Crimean Peninsula. City after city fell. Finally, trapped against the Black Sea, Wrangel ordered an evacuation. In November, more than 150,000 soldiers and civilians fled across the waters, leaving Russia behind forever. It was the end of the White cause. The Civil War, after years of carnage, was drawing to a close.
But victory for the Bolsheviks did not mean peace for the people. In the countryside, grain seizures left peasants starving. In the cities, workers tore down wooden houses for firewood. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus alone killed millions. Between 1918 and 1921, perhaps 10 million lives were lost, most of them civilians. And yet, in the midst of such ruin, the new Soviet state emerged. The promises of self-determination for non-Russian peoples dissolved under the reality of Red Army conquest. Azerbaijan fell in 1920. Armenia followed. Georgia resisted until 1921, but its fate was the same. The Bolsheviks spoke of freedom, but delivered control, Moscow's control.
Even in the Far East, where a puppet Far Eastern Republic briefly stood, it was only a mask. By 1922, when Japanese troops finally withdrew, the fiction was ended. The territory was absorbed into Soviet Russia, just as Lenin and his comrades had always intended. By the end of 1922, the Bolsheviks had done what seemed impossible in 1917. They had survived the collapse of empire, the onslaught of foreign armies, the fury of civil war, and the hunger of their own people. From the wreckage, they forged the Russian-Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, soon to be the heart of the Soviet Union. But survival came at a terrible cost. The revolution that had promised peace, land, and bread had delivered instead terror, famine, and war. The people were free from the Tsar, but were they any freer under the party? Had Russia been reborn, or had it merely traded one autocracy for another? By the winter of 1922, Russia was no longer a shattered battlefield, but the core of a new state, the Soviet Union. What had begun as a desperate gamble in Petrograd 5 years earlier now controlled the vast spaces once ruled by the Tsars. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had triumphed where so many expected them to fail. But at what cost? The cities lay hollowed out, their factories silent, their streets filled with orphans and beggars. The countryside smoldered with resentment. Peasants, once promised land, had seen their harvests seized at gunpoint. Soldiers, once promised peace, had fought year after year without end. Millions were dead, countless others displaced. And yet, amidst the ruins, the Bolsheviks declared victory, not only over their enemies, but over history itself. The party reshaped the very idea of Russia. No longer an empire of czars, nobles, and Orthodox priests, it was now proclaimed a state of workers and peasants. But was it truly theirs? Or was it the possession of a new elite, one cloaked not in crowns, but in ideology? The Soviets, once envisioned as councils of the people, became instruments of party power. Freedom of speech, of assembly, of dissent, all were extinguished in the name of survival. Still, the revolution's leaders believed they stood on the edge of a new world. For Lenin, the suffering of the Civil War was the birth pangs of a society unlike any seen before. Trotsky, the brilliant architect of the Red Army, imagined a future where the revolution would spread, unstoppable, across borders. But behind their vision, shadows lurked. Factions emerged within the party. Critics whispered of the growing bureaucracy. Even among revolutionaries, questions spread. Had they saved the revolution or betrayed it? And as the Bolsheviks consolidated power, one man was already maneuvering quietly in the background. He did not speak with the thunder of Trotsky, nor write with the fire of Lenin. Instead, Joseph Stalin built his strength patiently, step by step, in the machinery of party organization. Few noticed then, fewer still imagined that within a decade he would overshadow them all. So, what was the Russian Revolution, in the end? A glorious rebirth of the people? A tragedy of betrayal? Or the beginning of something darker still? It toppled an empire, tore apart a nation, and remade the world. But its legacy remains contested to this day.
And perhaps that is the true mystery. Revolutions promise liberation, yet so often deliver new chains. So what do you think? Was the Russian Revolution a triumph of the people, or the start of a new tyranny? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring the hidden histories that shaped our world, don't forget to subscribe, because the past still has secrets waiting to be uncovered.